The glittering chandeliers of the Grand Ballroom in Austin, Texas, cast a warm, deceptive glow over 200 of the city's most elite high society guests. The air inside the country club was thick with the suffocating scent of thousands of imported white orchids, expensive French perfume, and the low, melodic hum of a live string quartet. To anyone watching from the outside, this was a flawless fairy tale wedding, the grand union of an independent architectural designer and a brilliant green energy executive. But as I sat at the center of the lavishly decorated head table, the heavy ivory satin of my wedding dress felt like armor protecting me from a hidden, predatory malice. Across the pristine white silk tablecloth, my newly minted mother-in-law, Linda Clark, sat draped in emerald velvet, her eyes tracking my every movement with a chilling calculation. Linda was a woman who viewed her family's historic wealth not as a resource, but as a weapon of absolute control, and she treated my presence like an unpardonable invasion. For 18 months, she had systematically branded me as a low-class social climber and calculated outsider who had somehow managed to entrap her golden child son, Ethan. She had spent my entire engagement whispering venomous doubts into Ethan's ears, trying to force us into layout agreements that would strip me of any dignity. When Ethan firmly stood his ground, choosing to sign a fair, mutually negotiated prenuptial agreement that protected both of our independent careers, Linda's hostility had hardened into a silent, terrifying rage. She had smiled politely during the ceremony, her manicured hands clapping in perfect synchronization, but the sheer coldness radiating from her posture told me the battle was far from over. I kept my composure completely level, my face arranged into a calm, serene smile as the waitstaff began pouring the premium vintage champagne for the formal toasts. I had spent years managing high-stakes corporate design contracts under immense pressure, and I had learned early that the only way to defeat a narcissist is to remain completely unpredictable and entirely quiet. The true depths of Linda's psychological deception, however, were about to reveal themselves in a plot twist so dark it would forever alter the trajectory of our lives. As the wedding reception reached its peak and the room filled with the clinking of heavy crystal glasses, Ethan was pulled away from the table by a group of his primary corporate investors. Left alone at the head table, I watched as Linda slowly stood up from her seat, her face instantly shifting into a mask of warm, exaggerated maternal affection that made my skin crawl. She approached my side of the table, holding a vintage crystal decanter in one hand, her movements smooth, deliberate, and entirely graceful as she leaned over my shoulder. "You look absolutely breathtaking tonight, Hannah," Linda whispered, her voice carrying a soft, purring sweetness that was meant to mimic a genuine blessing. "I know we've had our differences during the planning phases, but I want to personally pour your celebratory glass to signify a completely fresh start between us." As she leaned in closer, pretending to gently adjust the delicate lace of my wedding veil with her left hand, her right hand executed a swift, highly practiced movement over my champagne flute. A tiny, colorless droplet slipped from a hidden vial concealed within her massive emerald ring, dissolving instantly into the effervescent bubbles of my drink. My forensic, hyper-observant eyes caught the microscopic distortion in the liquid, followed by the slight, nervous tremor in her manicured fingers as she pulled away. The terrifying truth hit me with a wave of pure, freezing clarity. Linda hadn't just poured me a drink, she had quietly introduced a potent chemical agent into my glass. Through a private security contact I had retained during the grueling wedding preparations, I knew that Linda had recently acquired a powerful, fast-acting sedative from a corrupt medical clinic. The substance was designed to temporarily impair my cognitive judgment and cloud my memory, leaving me completely compliant and unable to process complex information for a short window of time. Linda's master plan was as grotesque as it was brilliant. She intended to use the temporary impairment to corner me in the private bridal suite during the reception. There, away from the eyes of the guests, she would force me to sign a fraudulent, heavily altered prenuptial agreement that her private attorneys had secretly drafted behind Ethan's back. The altered document would completely strip me of my legal rights, forfeit my independent corporate shares, and grant Linda unilateral control over our future family trust funds. If I signed it under the influence of the sedative, she would claim I did so willingly during a rush of wedding day emotion, completely ruining my financial security forever. A dangerous, icy calm washed over my body as I looked up at my mother-in-law, my expression remaining entirely serene, showing absolutely no sign of panic. "To family, cheers," Linda said, raising her own filled glass with a smug, self-satisfied smile that told me she believed she had just successfully executed the perfect crime. "Please drink up, honey. The speeches are about to begin, and I want to make sure your glass is entirely empty before I take the microphone." "Thank you, Linda," I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and carrying a chilling level of politeness as I reached for the stem of my crystal glass. At that exact second, one of the catering captains accidentally dropped a heavy tray of silver coffee spoons behind the head table, causing a loud, clattering distraction. Linda instinctively turned her head toward the noise, her eyes breaking contact with me for less than 2 horizontal seconds. In that fleeting window of opportunity, my hands moved with the invisible, lightning-fast precision of a corporate chess player executing a lethal checkmate. With a seamless sleight of hand, I switched our identical crystal glasses, sliding my chemically altered trap directly into her position while pulling her clean drink toward me. When Linda turned back around, her face completely composed, she saw me holding my glass with a warm, relaxed posture that radiated total compliance. I raised the clean flute to my lips, taking a slow, measured sip of the champagne while watching Linda lift her own glass and eagerly consume the entire contents of her own chemical trap. She set the empty glass down on the white silk tablecloth, a flash of malicious triumph gleaming in her eyes as she walked back to her side of the table to prepare for her official toast. I sat back in my chair, adjusting the ivory fabric of my gown, a cold, calculating satisfaction settling deep into my soul as the hands of the clock crept forward. The chaotic fallout began exactly 15 minutes later, just as the venue coordinator dimmed the grand ballroom lights and directed the central spotlights toward the main podium. Linda stepped up to the microphone, her posture initial proud and regal, the epitome of an aristocratic matriarch commanding the attention of Austin's high society. "Good evening, everyone," Linda began, her booming voice echoing clearly through the silent, reverent rafters of the country club. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the marriage of my beautiful son, Ethan, to a girl who finally found a way into our world." As she spoke the final words, a sudden, heavy slur crept into her pronunciation, her eyelids fluttering violently as the potent sedative began to rapidly bypass her cognitive filters. Instead of putting her to sleep, the heavy chemical dose running through her system completely demolished her executive inhibitions, unleashing the raw, unfiltered malice she had hidden for months. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium for balance, her face flushing a dark, aggressive shade of red as she abandoned her prepared, elegant speech entirely. "You all think this is a fairy tale," Linda laughed, a sharp, unhinged cackle escaping her lips that sent an immediate, suffocating shockwave of silence through the room. "But I know the truth, and I'm not letting this basic, lower-class designer steal a single penny of the Clark family fortune that I spent 40 years protecting." Ethan turned his head toward the stage, his body instantly stiffening with a violent shock as he stared at his mother's unraveling features. "Linda, stop this immediately," Ethan whispered loudly from his seat, his voice shaking with a sudden, protective anger as he looked around at the horrified faces of his investors. Linda completely ignored her son's warning, her hands moving with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation as she violently unzipped her designer emerald clutch. She pulled out a thick stack of hidden, legal papers, waving them wildly in front of the 200 elite guests under the bright glare of the spotlights. "I have the real contract right here." Linda screamed into the microphone, her words completely slurred, but her intent terrifyingly clear to every ear in the room. "She's going to sign it tonight in the bridal suite. She's going to sign away her life, because I made sure she wouldn't have the brains to say no to me after that drink." I sat perfectly still at the head table, my face a mask of quiet, heartbroken innocence, allowing the entire high society community to witness the full depth of her psychological insanity. My university friends and corporate mentors stood up from their tables, their faces red with a righteous fury as they prepared to step between me and the screaming woman on the stage. Ethan stood up from his chair, his jaw tightly clenched, his eyes wide with an absolute, breathtaking horror as the pieces of his mother's criminal conspiracy laid themselves completely bare. He looked down at the empty glass sitting in front of Linda's empty seat, then looked at the hidden legal documents she was waving on the stage, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. "She tried to drug my wife," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with a devastating heartbreak that echoed louder than any scream in that silent ballroom. My husband didn't hesitate. He walked up the stairs of the stage with a heavy, definitive stride, aggressively snatching the microphone and the fraudulent documents from his mother's trembling hands. "Security, remove her from this venue immediately and call emergency medical services," Ethan commanded, his voice cold, steady, and entirely free of any maternal deference. Linda let out a horrified, breathless shriek as two uniformed country club security guards stepped onto the stage, gently but firmly locking her arms behind her back. She spent her final moments in the ballroom screaming slurred obscenities at the guests, her expensive emerald dress staining with sweat as she was publicly escorted out the front doors into the dark Texas night. The glamorous, high-society wedding had instantly transformed into a crime scene, the toxic illusion of the Clark family matriarchy completely shattered in front of the city's most powerful figures. The legal aftermath that unfolded over the subsequent months was executed with the cold, mathematical precision of an airtight corporate takeover. Ethan and I didn't waste a single hour processing the emotional shock. We immediately retained the services of the most formidable estate and criminal defense law firm in the state. The stack of papers Linda had proudly waved on the stage turned out to be a legal disaster for her. The document contained explicit clauses that proved her premeditated intent to commit financial fraud and coercion. Furthermore, our legal team secured the video surveillance footage from the country club's high-definition security cameras, capturing the exact angle of Linda leaning over my shoulder with the hidden vial. When federal investigators and local law enforcement presented the unassailable evidence to Linda's private attorneys, the arrogance that had defined her lifestyle vanished entirely overnight. To avoid a highly publicized, felony criminal trial that would carry a mandatory federal prison sentence for poisoning and identity coercion, Linda was forced to sign a total, unconditional surrender. She signed a binding, permanent non-contact restraining order that legally banned her from ever coming within 500 feet of Ethan, myself, or any future children we might bring into the world. Furthermore, Ethan utilized a hidden conflict of interest clause within the family's historical corporate statutes to systematically strip his mother of her voting rights in the green energy conglomerate. We forced her into an early, permanent retirement, completely freezing her access to the primary family investment funds and cutting her off from the massive corporate dividends she used as a weapon of control. The grand mansion she lived in was placed under a strict legal trust managed exclusively by our compliance attorneys, leaving her completely isolated and entirely powerless. She had spent a lifetime treating her son's love and my boundaries as disposable resources meant to feed her insatiable desire for dominance and aristocratic pride. She had to learn the hard, agonizing way that when you unleash a chemical trap against an observant mind, you don't get submission, you get a lifetime of absolute isolation. 2 years passed in a beautiful, uninterrupted current of pure professional success, immense wealth, and an unshakable personal peace. Ethan and I relocated our primary corporate offices to a stunning, sun-filled coastal estate far away from the toxic circles of Austin, building a sanctuary where our worth was never questioned. Our new home featured massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out over a quiet, rolling landscape filled with ancient oak trees and fresh, wild lavender. There were no emerald-draped matriarchs hovering over our dinner tables, and there were no manipulative voices whispering poison into the quiet hours of our evenings. The final closure of our past arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon when a certified legal package was delivered to our estate from the corporate compliance firm handling the family trusts. Attached to the standard financial disclosures was a short, crumpled letter written by Linda from her isolated retirement villa on the coast. I am sitting alone in this empty house with nothing but the sound of the ocean and the ghost of a family that completely left me behind, the letter read, her handwriting shaky and stripped of its old arrogance. Ethan won't answer my calls, my friends at the country club won't return my messages, and I have to ask a legal intermediary just to see photos of my own son's life. I hope your cold victory was worth what you did to this family. I held the small piece of paper over the fireplace, letting the flames catch the edges until the words turned into harmless gray ash that floated away into the quiet chimney. The destruction of her life hadn't been caused by my cold revenge. It was simply the natural, mathematical harvest of the bitter seeds she had planted over a lifetime of cruelty. She had tried to steal my future to protect her unearned control, and she was finally being forced to live in the silent, empty desert of her own creation. I walked over to the large glass windows of our living room, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant shades of gold and deep violet, Ethan's hand gently sliding into mine. People always say that home is where your family is, a beautiful, sentimental phrase that you see printed on commercial decorations and greeting cards. But as I stand in my quiet, protected sanctuary, watching the peaceful shadows lengthen across the beautiful white oak floors, I have learned a much deeper truth. Home isn't a geographic structure defined by a shared surname, a genetic code, or the toxic obligation to endure psychological abuse in the name of loyalty. Home is where your boundaries are treated as absolute, where your hard work is genuinely honored, and above all else, home is where you are respected.